Wands are a crucial and commonly discussed aspect of the Harry Potter series. They serve as the tool that allows witches and wizards to channel and harness their magical abilities. And throughout the series, the significance of wands is highlighted through the emphasis on wandlore, the notion of wand ownership, and the pivotal role wands play in duels and magical combat. But for some reason, goblins aren't allowed to use them. Goblins are given full control of the financial system, they're more than magically capable, and they're arguably more intelligent than wizardkind. But under the current Ministry of Magic's control, goblins are still prohibited from using or owning wands, under the severe consequence of a life sentence in Azkaban prison. So what's the deal? Why are goblins forbidden from owning wands? How powerful could they become if they did possess wands? And what underlying tensions exist between the goblin race and wizards? Join me today as we discuss the history of wizards and goblins, uncovering the truth behind why goblins have so few rights in magical society. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. Now, it shouldn't come across as any sort of a surprise when I tell you that goblins haven't been treated well over the course of wizarding history. Purebloods outright hated them, and in the past, even the most progressive members of the wizarding world felt a general mistrust for the tiny, monstrous humanoid creatures. But where did all of this animosity come from? If we take a look back at wizarding history, there has been conflict upon conflict between wizards and goblins, with the goblins rebelling on numerous occasions. And while wizards typically treated other human-like creatures like the giants with a fair bit of fear, they never really outwardly displayed the same concern for goblins. Just like humans of the ancient world looked down on wizards, it seems that from the earliest records, wizards treated goblins with an equal amount of disdain. But if we spend a bit more time talking about the early relationship between wizards and the goblin community, we'll find a peculiar niche that the shorter, more monstrous creatures developed for themselves. Goblins were extremely talented in a handful of things. For starters, they were incredibly smart, and the word often used to describe them was cunning. This, combined with their love for precious metals, made them great gold and silversmiths. And at one point in the 11th century, the goblins even crafted the sword of Godric Gryffindor, the very same blade that would serve Gryffindor's heirs in the centuries to come. But the weapon's origins are far darker than you might guess. Among the many cultural differences that brought strife to wizards and goblins in the Middle Ages, the most contentious idea was that of ownership. To wizards it was simple. If you bought something, then you owned it. But to goblins, it was far more complex. Purchasing an item, no matter how expensive, didn't mean that you owned it. Most goblins simply thought that you were renting the sword or necklace or what have you for the duration of your life, and goblins could collect it upon your passing. You see, to goblins, ownership always belonged to the creator of the item, and when wizards tried to pass down their goblin-forged heirlooms, it wasn't uncommon for goblins and wizard heirs to come to blows. So when it comes to Gryffindor's sword, you can see why the goblins would hold a grudge. Even before Godric died, the sword's creator, King Ragnarok, tried to manipulate his fellow magical creatures into stealing the blade. That's how much he loved the weapon. In the years following Gryffindor's death, Ragnarok and his fellow goblins were insulted even more as the sword stayed in Hogwarts and passed through the hands of wizard heirs for nearly 1,000 years. This tale, and others like it, were one of the main sources of resentment that launched the Goblin rebellions. These historical conflicts are key to understanding why goblins are prohibited from carrying wands. In the present day, I think it's safe to say that tensions have lowered, but that things certainly have a long way to go. These days, goblins are in charge of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, overseeing all of the responsibilities associated with currency in the wizarding world. And in this more modern era, it would appear that the more progressive members of wizarding society have almost started to treat them as equals. But the goblins' history with Gringotts actually goes back a long way, all the way to 1474 when they first founded it. Thanks to their cunning, goblins were entrusted with the wealth of the British wizarding community, and even in Harry Potter's era, over 500 years later, Gringotts was the premier bank. And this fact remained consistent throughout all of the tumultuous periods in history where wizardkind were at odds with goblins. For centuries, goblins patiently managed the banks and almost all of the finance in the wizarding world, and for that reason and more, they were among the most important beings in the entire magical community. But even in the decades that followed Gringotts' foundation, the goblins continued to suffer harsh treatment from human wizards. Throughout that time, there were likely small protests and battles that the goblins waged in order to gain rights. But it wasn't until the Goblin Rebellion of 1612 that historians decided to pay attention and record the events. We're not quite certain about the exact location, but it seems that this armed conflict arose in or around Hogsmeade Village. The goblin forces took an inn as their base and ravaged the nearby buildings, setting many of them on fire. The exact number of lives laid down on both sides has been lost to the years, but the casualties were remarkably high, at least according to Hogwarts' 5th year History of Magic class. And when we look at the exact cause of this rebellion, there's no shortage of reasons for why the goblins would have started it. At a glance, the average goblin was far more important to the lives of wizards and witches around England, although the same could be said for house elves, who more often than not kept houses clean and meals on the table. Goblins were responsible for far more skilled tasks. Goblins forged the most powerful weapons, indestructible armor, and through their natural propensity for hoarding gold, goblins basically kept the entire wizarding economy moving forward. And yet, wizards and witches looked down on them wherever they went. Not only that, they almost always refused to teach them the ways of wandlore, which meant that goblins had to accomplish their magical feats with the far more difficult and more dangerous technique of wandless magic. Even the highest court in Britain, the Wizengamot, refused to allow a goblin a seat, and without fair representation, it's likely that the goblins decided enough was enough, subsequently rebelling in the year 1612. And while the 1612 Goblin Rebellion was probably necessary to begin the process of igniting any sort of change, it didn't change anything by itself. In fact, it made things worse. In response to the display of violence in Hogsmeade, the wizarding community of Britain convened and created a series of laws that restricted non-human magical creatures. The harshest among them was a new Code of Wand Use, which the Wizards' Council passed less than 2 decades after the rebellion. The Code of Wand Use was a ruling on wand utilization established by the Wizards' Council in 1631. Clause 3, popularly referred to as the Wand Ban, explicitly prohibited any non-human being from possessing or employing a wand. This code comprised a total of 8 clauses that outlined the regulations concerning the use of wands. This restricted wands to human wizards, and made it a crime for goblins, house elves, giants, and other non-humans to wield them. While human wizards simply hoarded wand lore in the centuries before, now it was actually illegal for goblins to study and possess wands. At a glance, you can see how this law made it almost impossible for goblins to defend themselves from wand-armed wizards and witches. But if you think about it more carefully, the restriction on wand ownership would completely hinder the ability of goblins to develop independent of the wizarding community, and meant that they would always depend on them. But this wasn't the last time that the goblins would fight for their rights. Eventually, the goblins led a second rebellion that led to the resignation of 2 ministers and came very close to achieving victory for the goblins. If not for the intervention of a 3rd Minister for Magic, who decisively ended the conflict after 7 tumultuous years, bringing an end to the uprising, the goblins may have been successful. And despite these events, the ministry has remained steadfast in its refusal to amend the Code of Wand Use under any circumstances. Wand ownership is almost a rite of passage in wizarding society. When you're old enough, you head off to Ollivander's and you're paired with a wand that's carefully curated for you. It represents the beginning of your personalized journey into discovering your magical capabilities. It's special, but goblins are excluded from this, and it just doesn't seem fair. But perhaps the most shocking part of all of this is that the devastating legislative blow dealt to goblins by wizardkind remains to this day, despite goblins existing as one of the cornerstones of wizarding society. And in return, goblins have continued to be treated like second-class citizens. In recent times, the Brotherhood of Goblins, an advocacy group fighting for goblin rights, has persistently protested against these laws, but they've yet to see any sort of success. Now you might be wondering, what is the big deal? Why keep wands out of the hands of goblins? Is it a matter of principle, or is there something else at play here? The first thing to consider is that goblins are not human and possess unique DNA and magical characteristics akin to elves. Their innate magical abilities operate differently from those of humans, with magic flowing through them in a distinct manner. This raises the question of whether goblins, who excel in wandless magic, could potentially wield a wand more effectively than humans. And I suspect that it's the perceived threat of goblins potentially using wands to challenge wizarding authority and power that are a significant factor in the prohibition. The code of wand use could very well be used as a precautionary measure to maintain the current power dynamics within the magical society, as allowing goblins access to wands could disrupt the established order. Furthermore, the ministry's hesitation to grant goblins the same magical rights as wizards might be deeply rooted in prejudiced beliefs about the abilities and trustworthiness of goblins. And that's it for this video. What do you think about the way that goblins are treated in Harry Potter? If they were given wands, would they pose a threat to wizardkind? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.